In the late 19th century, the territory of modern-day Ukraine was divided between the Russian Empire, which controlled central and eastern regions like Kiev and Kharkiv, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which governed western regions like Galicia. The inhabitants spoke numerous languages including Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, German, Yiddish, and Tatar. Throughout the 19th century, Ukrainian speakers faced pressure to adopt languages like Russian, Polish, or German, as higher education and career advancement were often tied to those languages. Most Ukrainian speakers held no leading roles in the bureaucracy or politics of either empire. The majority were peasants working land largely owned by Polish-Russian or Polonized or Russified Ukrainian landlords. In the Russian-controlled territories, most people in cities like Kiev and Kharkiv spoke Russian, though this did not always mean they identified as ethnic Russians, as language was not the sole determinant of national identity in Central and Eastern Europe. As in much of Eastern Europe, a Ukrainian nationalist movement gained strength during the 19th century. Poets like Taras Shevchenko and Ivan Franko historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky and the Greek Catholic Church all contributed to a growing sense of modern Ukrainian identity. Hrushevsky developed a historical narrative tracing Ukrainian nationhood back to the medieval Kievan Rus, challenging Russian claims that Russia inherited historical continuity from that state. The Ukrainian nationalist movement faced significant obstacles. Many peasants were illiterate. The concept of modern nation-states was unfamiliar to them, and the Russian Empire suppressed the Ukrainian language, fearing it could turn the population against the Tsar. A secret decree in 1876 banned new publications, public performances, and imports of works in Ukrainian, with many Russian thinkers dismissing Ukrainians as mere Little Russians. In contrast, late 19th century Austria-Hungary permitted the use of Ukrainian in public life and education. Only after the 1905 Russian Revolution did Russian authorities grant limited freedoms for Ukrainian expression, spurring an independence movement and national revival. In 1907, journalist Wilhelm Feldman commented, "The 20th century has seen so many nations rise from ashes, but there are few cases of rebirth so rapid and energetic as that of the Ukrainians of Austria. Their unexpected and vigorous growth is mostly the result of self-help and hard-fought gains. The Ukrainian independence movement was small, but growing when two events in 1914 altered its trajectory. In March 1914, the Tsarist government denied permission for Ukrainians to celebrate the centenary of Taras Shevchenko's birth, fueling nationalist sentiment. The second event was the outbreak of World War I. Modern Ukrainian territory, especially Austrian Galicia, suffered terribly from fighting in 1914 and 1915. Ukrainians fought on both sides with 28,000 volunteering for the Austro-Hungarian army, but both empires suspected Ukrainians of disloyalty. Austrian authorities, fearing espionage for Russia, interned tens of thousands in camps and executed thousands more. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary encouraged anti-Russian sentiment among Ukrainians in the Russian Empire, supporting the creation of the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine. Russia intensified its crackdown on Ukrainian language and cultural institutions. As the war progressed, Russian dissidents like Vladimir Lenin closely monitored the aspirations of minority groups like Ukrainians, seeing them as potential allies to dismantle the Tsarist system. Yet Lenin believed Ukraine should remain part of a unified Russian political and economic unit. Before the February 1917 revolution, he viewed minority movements as strategic partners. "We would be very poor revolutionaries if in a great liberating war of the proletariat for socialism, we were unable to utilize every national movement against separate negative forms of imperialism in order to sharpen and broaden the crisis." Lenin knew little about Ukrainian affairs, and like many Russian intellectuals, assumed Ukrainians were attached to Russia's superior culture and economic power. Opportunity and conflict after the February 1917 Revolution. When the February Revolution of 1917 replaced the Tsar with a weak Russian Republic, Ukrainian nationalist groups seized their chance for independence. On March 17 of 1917, the day after the Tsar's abdication, the Society of Ukrainian Progressives announced the formation of the Central Rada chaired by Mikhailo Hrushevsky. The Rada's plan was to govern Ukraine as an autonomous member of a future Russian federal system, which did not yet exist and was not part of the new Russian government's plans in St. Petersburg. Instead, the Russian government offered limited autonomous administration, excluding industrial regions like Donbass and the Black Sea coast. The Rada rejected this and announced its intent to pass its own laws, let Ukraine be free. Without separating themselves entirely from Russia, without severing connections with the Russian state, let the Ukrainian people in their own land have the right to order their own lives. Let law and order in Ukraine be given by the all-national Ukrainian parliament, elected by universal equal direct and secret suffrage. From this day forth we shall direct our own lives. In the ensuing Russia-wide elections dominated by land reform debates, the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionary Party, allied with the Russian Socialist Revolutionary Party, but seeking an independent path for Ukraine, secured a strong victory with majority peasant support. At the Kharkiv Peasants' Congress in May 1917, a delegate invoked the 17th-century Ukrainian Cossack state's fight against Polish lords. 300 years ago, we rose up against the pans and took everything into our hands. We lived prosperously and free. Schools developed Ukraine was an enlightened region, and from us learned people went to Muscovy. And what do we see now? 13 literates in 100 people. We have not gone forward, but backward. Ukraine needs Ukrainian schools. The Ukrainian language has to enter the middle schools and universities. Ukraine ought to govern itself to conduct its own business with its own Rada in Kiev. Not all residents of Ukraine supported independence and national development. In urban areas home to many Poles, Russians and Jews, only 10% of votes went to pro-Ukrainian parties. The Bolsheviks voiced ambiguous support for the Ukrainian cause to win voters, but garnered only about 5% support in Ukraine. Few Ukrainians backed the Bolsheviks in the short-lived Russian Republic, but after the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, their approach to Ukraine shifted from theory to practice. Conflict with the Bolsheviks. Initially, troops loyal to the Rada aided Lenin during the October Revolution, as the Bolsheviks seemed sympathetic to the Ukrainian movement. However, the relationship soured when Lenin adopted a centralized policy. He spoke of the socio-economic unity of Russia and argued that self-determination should not undermine proletarian unity. Unconditional recognition of the struggle for freedom of self-determination does not at all obligate us to support every demand for national self-determination. We ought always and unconditionally to strive for a very close union of the proletariat of all nationalities, and only in exceptional cases can we accept the creation of a new class state or the substitution of full political unity of the state by a weaker federal union. Bolshevik leader Joseph Stalin opposed significant autonomy for Ukrainians and other peoples of the former Russian Empire, fearing these regions might fall under imperialist influence. We are against the separation of the border regions from Russia, since separation would here involve imperialist servitude for the border regions, thus undermining the revolutionary power of Russia and strengthening the position of imperialism. As the Bolsheviks' violent takeover became evident, the Rada shifted its stance. On November 6, 1917, it declared opposition to the October Revolution and vowed to defend itself, which it did during a Bolshevik-inspired uprising in Kiev the following week. On November 19th, the Rada proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic (UPR), stating it did not seek complete separation from Russia. and was open to joining a future Russian federal system. The UPR minted its own currency and flew a blue and yellow flag with colors reversed compared to the modern version. The Bolshevik response came on December 16th. Lenin issued an ultimatum recognizing the UPR's right to exist, but accusing it of a two-faced bourgeois policy and aiding counter-revolutionary forces. He demanded security guarantees, including support for the Red Army with war, as the consequence of non-compliance within 48 hours. The UPR refused. It is impossible to recognize simultaneously the right of a people to self-determination, including separation, and at the same time to infringe roughly on that right by imposing on the people in question a certain type of government. On the territory of the Ukrainian People's Republic, all power belongs to Ukrainian democracy, and therefore any attempt to overthrow that power by force will be met by force. The Bolsheviks retaliated by withdrawing to Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, establishing a Ukrainian Socialist Republic they claimed as the legitimate government. In late December, they launched an offensive on Kyiv, joined by some Ukrainian peasants supporting Bolshevik radical ideology. Pro-Bolshevik uprisings erupted in several cities, and in January and February 1918, the Red Army captured Odessa, Mykolaiv, Dnipro, and Kyiv. The Rada government fled to Zhytomyr, and the UPR was defeated. German and Austro-Hungarian intervention. The creation of the UPR was the culmination of a Ukrainian nationalist dream and a savvy political move. As an independent state, it could enter treaties with other powers. In 1918, Germany and Austria-Hungary, seeking deals in Eastern Europe, recognized the UPR. Ukraine, long considered the breadbasket of Europe due to its fertile soil and high grain yields, was critical for the Central Powers. By 1918, the Allied blockade and their own economic mismanagement had caused severe food shortages, with hundreds of thousands dying of starvation. On the day the Red Army entered Kyiv, the UPR signed the Bread Peace Treaty with Germany and Austria, Hungary pledging 100,000 train carloads of grain and seeds in exchange for the Polish city of Chelm, and improved language rights for Ukrainians in Austria-Hungary. However, the UPR, having lost much of its territory to the Bolsheviks and lacking sufficient trains and railroads, could not deliver. On February 18th, German and Austro-Hungarian forces marched into Ukraine, clearing the Bolsheviks from Kharkiv and Donbas within a month. They reinstated the Rada, but displeased with its socialist leanings and slow grain deliveries, the Central Powers disbanded it in April, replacing it with a puppet state called the Hetmanate under Pavlo Skoropadsky. German leaders believed Skoropadsky would be compliant. In Hetman, Skoropadsky, we found a man with whom it was very easy to get along. Skoropadsky's regime promoted the Ukrainian language, but reversed the Rada's land reforms, seizing peasants' grain for Germany. The Central Powers' occupation sparked resistance. Numerous armed groups, including the anarchist Black Army, led by Nestor Makhno, which controlled large parts of eastern Ukraine, fought against the Hetman's troops and the Central Powers. The Directory and the Second UPR. When Germany surrendered to the Allies in November 1918, Skoropadsky's days were numbered. The most powerful political force in Ukraine became the Directory led by nationalists Volodymyr Vynnychenko and Simon Petliura. By December 1918, they rallied most of the peasantry and overthrew Skoropadsky, reinstating the UPR and the Rada, though under stricter control. New states and further conflict. As World War I ended, the Ukrainian People's Republic was re-established in Kyiv, but other new states emerged, leading to further conflict. The collapse of the Russian Empire, Germany, and Austria-Hungary gave rise to a new Polish Republic and the West Ukrainian People's Republic, WUPR, in the linguistically and ethnically mixed former Austro-Hungarian province of East Galicia. centered on Lemberg, now Lviv. In November 1918, street fighting between Polish and West Ukrainian nationalists in Lemberg escalated into the Ukrainian-Polish War of 1919. Poland, far stronger, and supported by the Allies in its war against Bolshevik Russia, held the advantage. The head of the Ukrainian delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, Arnold Margolin, expressed frustration. The Americans are as uninformed about Ukrainians as the average European is about numerous African tribes. Facing more numerous, better trained, and better equipped Polish forces, the WUPR sought aid from the UPR. On paper, the two Ukrainian republics united in 1919, but in practice, they did not cooperate as the WPR's main enemy was Poland, while the UPR focused on Bolshevik Russia. Since Poland was also fighting Bolshevik Russia, the UPR was reluctant to join the WPR's war. By May 1919, Polish forces defeated the WPR army and established control over East Galicia, the Russian Civil War and Ukraine as a battlefield. The West Ukrainian state was crushed by Poland by mid-1919. Meanwhile, the Kiev-based UPR, re-established by the Directory, remained fragile as the Russian Civil War's front lines reached Ukrainian soil. Ukraine became a primary battlefield for Bolshevik revolutionaries, white counter-revolutionaries, anarchists, peasant movements, and Allied intervention forces. In late 1918 and early 1919, Bolshevik leadership was divided on where to focus forces. They launched an offensive to recapture Kharkiv, re-establishing the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, hoping to open a corridor to support the struggling Hungarian Soviet Republic. Red Army commander Vladimir Antonov Ovseyenko, frustrated by the lack of reinforcements, appealed directly to Lenin Vladimir Ilyich. They call to us from the Ukraine. The workers everywhere welcome the Bolsheviks. They curse the radists. But the radists triumph thanks to our inaction and are being quickly organized. In such circumstances, I have resolved to go forward. At the moment, with our naked hands and with courage, it is possible to take what later will have to be taken with bloodshed. Antonov Ovseyenko also pushed Lenin to allow a separate Ukrainian Communist Party to be announced before the invasion to lend legitimacy to Bolshevik aspirations in Ukraine. In December 1918, the Red Army took Kharkiv, in January Kiev in February, and clashed with French and Greek troops in southern Ukraine, who withdrew in April 1919. The Bolsheviks formed the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, implementing land collectivization that angered peasants resentful of communal ownership. This state, too, was short-lived. In May 1919, the White Russian Army under General Anton Denikin burst out of southern Russia, capturing Kharkiv and Donbass in July and most of Ukraine by August, aiming to keep Ukraine within a reformed Russian Empire if they won the Civil War. As rival armies marched across Ukraine, terror often followed much of it, directed at the Jewish population. Between 1918 and 1920, an estimated 1,500 anti-Semitic pogroms occurred in Ukraine, primarily perpetrated by White Russian and Ukrainian nationalist forces, with lesser involvement by the Red Army and Polish forces. The Directory and Whites associated local Jewish populations with Bolshevism, with deadly consequences. Over 100,000 Jews in Ukraine were killed during this period. The Polish-Soviet War and Soviet consolidation. The Civil War had already devastated Ukraine when the Whites conquered most of the country in summer 1919, and the prospects for an independent Ukraine looked bleak. In late 1919, the Red Army scored a decisive victory over the Whites, reoccupying Kiev for the third time in December and expelling the last Whites from Crimea in 1920. However, unpopular Bolshevik land policies and political terror turned many Ukrainian peasants against them. Ukrainian communist Volodymyr Zatonsky later recalled, "We submitted ourselves to elements of the peasantry who, although very much sympathetic to Bolshevism, were nonetheless very suspicious, to say the least, of communism. Previously, the Bolsheviks had said, "Arm yourself, beat the landlord, and seize his land." The communists now say, "Give the state your bread. Subject yourselves to discipline. Give us your weapons." It is no surprise that they turned against us with almost the same ferocity with which they had risen up against the hetman and Petliura. In spring 1920, the Polish-Soviet War erupted when Polish forces attacked the Red Army and advanced to Kyiv. Simon Petliura, who had fled to Poland after his defeat by the Red Army, led his remaining UPR troops alongside the Poles. Petliura's alliance with the Polish state that had crushed the WUPR caused resentment among some Ukrainian leaders, like former Directory member Vinnichenko. Petliura is an unhealthily ambitious maniac soaked up to his ears in the blood of pogromized Jewry, politically illiterate, a pernicious and filthy gladiator slave of the Entente. Polish success in Ukraine was brief. The Red Army launched a counteroffensive in June 1920, retaking Kyiv and pushing the Poles back to Warsaw. The 1921 Peace of Riga left most of western Ukraine under Polish control, and the rest under Bolshevik rule. Lenin now sought to win over Ukrainians, avoiding the intense Russification of the previous Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, at least temporarily. He permitted limited Ukrainian national identity expression tied to international socialism, and officially allowed the recognized Ukrainian Soviet government to secede, though he strongly advised against it. We are opponents of national animosity, national differences, national peculiarities. We are internationalists. We strive for a close union and complete amalgamation of all workers and peasants of all nations of the world in one world Soviet Republic. Stalin focused on Ukraine's strategic value, Central Russia, that hearth of world revolution cannot hold out long without the assistance of border regions which abound in raw materials, fuel, and foodstuffs. The nominal autonomy of the Ukrainian Communist Party soon vanished. In May 1920, the Red Army absorbed armed Ukrainian communist units, and the Party Central Committee took over Ukraine's administration, abolishing its foreign ministry. The Russian Communist Party justified this. The foreign policy of the Ukraine has not and cannot have any interests different from Russia, which is just such a proletarian state as the Ukraine. The heroic struggle of Russia in full union with the Ukraine on all fronts against domestic and foreign imperialists is now giving place to an equally united diplomatic front. In 1922, Soviet Ukraine became one of the four founding republics of the USSR alongside Russia, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federative Republic. In theory, these republics had the right to secede, but not in practice. Ukraine's transformation from 1917 to 1922 was marked by a shift from a system where one person ruled with the assistance of a secret police and a giant unwieldy bureaucracy to one where one party ruled with the assistance of a secret police and a giant unwieldy bureaucracy. Ukraine emerged from war, chaos, and famine in 1922 without an independent state, despite multiple attempts at independence. Over 1 million inhabitants had died. Only in 1991 would Ukraine leave the Soviet Union and establish an independent republic, readopting the yellow and blue flag, outlawed for over 70 years.